computer. Okay, so let's get back to, okay, welcome everybody. I'm Ken Knabb, and as you probably know, we're in the middle of a series of discussions on my new book, The Joy of Revolution and Related Texts. And we've already finished the Joy of Revolution part of it and are looking at some later texts. And for this meeting, which is the 5th out of 6, we're going to be exclusively talking about the Occupy movement. It happens that I was really involved in that, and I wrote a lot of texts and gave talks and so on. And they are in this book. So the people here have mostly read those texts. So I think I'm just going to be fairly brief about, just give a little quick rundown about what is there, and then we can pop around, with questions and comments. So there's 8 different texts here. And the Occupy movement, as you may remember, started in October. Well, it started in September 2011. And it continued for several months. There were sort of after effects going on even 6 or 8 months later, but it was kind of mostly in those first few months. So when that started happening, I almost immediately realized, hey, this is something really outstanding, unusual, almost unprecedented here. And so I started working on a leaflet that I would, say something about it. And by the time I finished the leaflet, the movement was about 4 weeks old. Yeah, so it was later in October. And I put out this leaflet called The Awakening in America. And it was a literal leaflet on 2 sides of a paper that I personally distributed 15,000 copies of, mostly in the Bay Area, but I also mailed hundreds of copies to other occupies and stuff like that. And when I was just completing that, I was invited to give a talk at Occupy Oakland. I'm in Berkeley, so it's just next door. And so the next text is a transcription of that talk. And there's also an audio recording of it, where I went to downtown Oakland and talked about the Occupy movement and did some Q&A. And then that went over real well, and they said, why don't you come back next week and you can bring the Society of the Spectacle film of Guy Debord, and we'll have a showing here, and have hundreds of people out in Occupy Oakland Square watching it. But before that could happen, about 4 days later, the police invaded Occupy Oakland and completely trashed it, and fenced it off, arrested some people. And the next day, there was obviously reaction to that. And I was there, and we were marching around, and including trying to march to the jail where people were arrested and so on. And later that day, there was some violence on the part of the police, needless to say. And there was a veteran from the Iraqi war, some guy in his 20s or something like that, that was involved in that. And he was hit in the head by a tear gas canister. And so he was in pretty bad shape from that, and was lying down. And so some people rushed in to help him out. And while those people were crowding around him, one of the Oakland cops just lobbed a grenade. They're called flash bombs. or flash grenade, something like that, right in the middle of him, so it landed right next to the guy's face and blew up. So that was so outrageous, and it was on the news, and it was, people had it, that by the next morning, the city government, particularly the so-called progressive mayor of Oakland, was in such a huge problem because of this. Like uh, everybody hated this. Like, she had a Facebook page and where anybody could comment, and there were thousands of comments. And like, somebody looked at 500 of them, and there was not one positive message. I mean, like, everybody all over the place, just by the thousands, were saying, "What in the fuck are you doing?" Because was the one that ordered the police to do this. So uh, what that happened, so I wrote a thing called Yesterday in Oakland, describing what had happened there. And that very, like, within 24 hours of or 48 hours, I can't, I guess it was 48 hours after it had been closed and fenced off, you could not see a policeman around there. They had just backed off. Obviously, they had been told, "Get the fuck out of there," by the mayor, because it was just such horrible PR, that they just said, "Get out of there," and so the police were away. And so then the occupiers just went back and peaceably took down the fence and, put it away and resumed a huge meeting. There were more than 1,500 people there, like to say, what are we going to do with this? And they voted at that meeting by about 95% to have a call for a general strike in Oakland a week later, November 2nd. And so then a couple days later, I put out another leaflet called "Welcome to the Oakland General Strike," in which I described what the plans were, what the reasons were, and answered various objections that people might have. Oh, we can't do this, or it's going to be dangerous, or, blah, blah, blah. If you strike in the schools, what will happen to the children? And so I say, bring the children to Occupy Oakland. That'll give them some real lessons, and so on. So then we had that November 2nd event, and it was a large strike, and something in the neighborhood of 50,000 people showed up at Occupy Oakland in that area. And about half of them, i.e., like 20 or 30,000, marched off to the port of Oakland, which was like, a couple miles away or something, and shut down the port of Oakland, which is one of the world's biggest ports. And uh, so things were really going well there. Then there was some follow-up that evening where we'll go into this but there was some vandalism by a few people. And the next morning, you would read the news about this event, Port of Oakland is shut down, but the front pages had "Windows broken, vandals. Does Occupy Oakland defend that?" I mean, it's a typical reaction, that you get when somebody does some moronic thing like that. We talked about this a little bit on the last meeting, and we can go into that. But anyway, that sort of set a little different tone. But for the next few months, there was still some momentum with the Occupy movement. And meanwhile, I wrote another thing called "The Situationists and the Occupy Movements, 1968 2011. in which I compared May 68 with the present Occupy movement, and showed how it was, some things were different, but a number of things were the same, and that people had spontaneously come up with the idea that the Situationists had been very influential in the Occupy movement, and they had been, even if the average person never heard of the Situationists. I wrote David Graeber at the time, and I said, you know, I was this an influence. He says, oh, he was one of the Occupy Wall Street original people. And he said, oh, well, all of us have read The Situationists, of course. Whether was some particular influence, I don't know, you know, it was just sort of in the air, you know, that, so anyway, so I used that text to debate with a couple people who had written articles about who are the Situationists and are they behind this and that kind of thing. And then a French radical web paper or something contacted me in November of 2011 and said they wanted to interview me by email about the Occupy movement. And it was kind of flattering. They were saying, well, you know, here in France, we're not sure what's going on there. We hear different things. And so we picked you because we know you're hip to the Situationists and blah, blah, blah. And we also know that you're really involved in this. So they asked me some questions and I answered there. And then a couple months later, I was invited to give a talk at the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library in Oakland. And that was also kind of on the theme of Situationists and Occupy. And then a year later, you know, that November 2012 or so on, and yet another French group wanted to email me looking back on Occupy. It's been a year later. It's now hardly around. You know, what do you conclude from this experience? And so that was a much longer email interview where they would just send me a question and I could just take my time and, you know, write a page-long answer and about these things. So that ended up being a rather large document there. So those are the 8 texts we've done. And I think I'll start out, I think just by Q&A, we will get to more details about what did I think about this or whatever. So any of you, please raise your digital hand if you have questions or comments on any of these texts or on Occupy in general. Mike, let's unmute yourself.
Okay, just to start it off, I Occupy in general. I was involved in the Perth, Australian kind of Occupy thing, and here there was a situation where the Queen of Australia was coming from Britain to a meeting of the Commonwealth government, and basically that became a focus of Trotskyist factions organizing efforts. Trotskyist, this group was called Socialist Alliance, and I've put a link to a YouTube that I did at the peak of the Occupy in Perth in the chat section. So anybody who wants to see what the flavor of the moment was in Perth, they can check that out. But almost all the speakers in that at that meeting were Socialist Alliance types, and they were trying to get people to go to their demonstration against the Commonwealth government thing. Um, so unfortunately, there wasn't any call for a general strike or anything like that. And overall, I've looked at many of the YouTube things about Occupy, and my main criticism is the same criticism that I have of most of these things: is that the central issue from my point of view is the wage system, and nobody talks about it. The wage system is what generates the 1%. Your reproduction of that, going to work every day, is what generates the 1%. And it's not a question of good and evil. It's a question of everyday life, like maybe Vanagem might say, but Vanagem never mentions the wage system either.
Oh,
So
yes, yes, he does. Yeah, maybe not as often as you would like, but
all of these things, because there's no theory behind it. There's just people's reactions, their emotional reactions. But there is this underlying sense that there is this 1%. There is there and people were starting to grasp that there is a ruling class, and I think that that's partially what's motivating a lot of the left wing capitalism kind of reform things today via DSA, is that there is this sense that didn't really exist before the Occupy movement, that there is this top tier of people who are telling everybody what to do, including the government, and they're occupying the government,
yeah.
basically destroying it now. Anyway, that's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you. Kim?
I was quite involved in the Oakland Occupy. Even though I live in Vallejo, I was down there 2, 3, 4 times a week. I didn't camp out there, but I had friends who did. But before Occupy, I was involved in a group called US Uncut, meaning US Uncut, the budget cuts. It had nothing to do with circumcision. And it was influenced by a similar group in England, UK Uncut. And so we would go into businesses, particularly tax avoidance corporations like Bank of America, FedEx, Verizon, Wells Fargo, Apple, and we would disrupt their business. And we usually had a theme, like once we had Vampires for Empire. I played the part of a doctor. And we had people on the street coming and joining us. So we did that. And if management asked us to leave, we would leave and continue out on the street. This was all in San Francisco. And I used to get frustrated because this was in the era of flash mobs, and there weren't that many people showing up. Occasionally there were 100, 150. Like once we had a choreographed dance at the headquarters of the Bank of America. But a lot of times there'd be only 30, 35 people. And I was frustrated. I thought, where is everybody? And finally, eventually, 6 months later, Occupy broke out. And I was so thrilled and so thankful. And then US Uncut became incorporated into Occupy. So I was on the general strike. I went to the general strike. I did not see militants dressed in black on that day, but also went on the funeral for capitalism. That was a great event. In the evening, we went to various banks and had little ceremonies, candle light ceremonies. And out of Occupy Oakland, well, I joined the research group. I didn't know anybody, but that's what I wanted to do. So I went down. We met periodically, I think once a week in some building in downtown Oakland, and we did research. And after Occupy was eliminated, after the tents were eliminated from Oscar Grant Plaza, the research group continued on. And for that whole next summer of 2012, every Saturday we'd go to a neighborhood in Oakland and meet with people and ask them what their experiences were. And we would record interviews. And the idea was this is going to be archived. So that continued for months after the tents were eliminated. And also, Occupy Forum started in San Francisco, which was run by my friend Ruthie Sockheim. And I would go to that every Monday, and we'd have a different presentation by a different person every week on a different topic. So that went on for years. So all this came out of Occupy Oakland and San Francisco. And the 1%, 99%, if you look in David Graeber's book, Democracy Project, which is sort of his review of Occupy, his reminiscence of Occupy, he explains where that came from. It came from an article in Vanity Fair by Joseph Stiglitz, who said something about it's the government is for the 1%, by the 1%.
Of the 1%.
Yeah, of the 1%. And so Graeber and some of the people he was working with thought about that and thought, well, if they're the 1%, then what's the rest of us? We're the 99%. So they created that slogan. Sometimes Graeber is given credit for it, but he always says it was a group effort. So
Yeah.
also I don't know if you ever met Christophe Lepore, who was part of Oakland Occupy. I'll post this in the chat. I found this. I didn't know it was available anymore, but he had a great interview on KPFA with Chris Hedges. Chris Hedges had written an article about Black Bloc is the cancer of Occupy, and Christophe had a different opinion since he was very much involved with Occupy Oakland, and Hedges wasn't. And it's a really good interview. I just listened to it yesterday. I didn't know it was still available because it was from.
Can you put a link to that in the chat?
Yeah, it's from 2012, I think.
Yeah, fine.
So,
Yeah,
so
I may have seen that at the time. It sounds very familiar. Uh, just I'm going to break in here. There's, of course, a lot of these videos and so on that are saved on YouTube, but this is one that I thought, let's see here. Okay, can you see this?
yeah,
Okay, I hope I'm going to play this. This is in Occupy Wall Street, and uh, it's, I guess it speaks for itself. It's a guy proposing to his girlfriend using the people's mic, where everybody repeats everything. So this is right in the middle of this.
My speech a little bit. That moment is now. That moment is now. But I hope using all these people ask and their voices to ask. My life. Will you?
I've covered several of the highest scoring.
Okay. The sound was bad, right?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but I'm not sure I've seen that same clip and it was fine. Basically, he's talking to his girlfriend and he's saying, this is the time, uh, I want to ask you to marry me. And if you do, I think that our relationship is going to be just as beautiful as this thing that's going on around us right now, and everybody's cheering. It's just something like it's I guess I don't need to comment, like that's so far away from we were talking earlier about Vanagem, this pleasure and stuff like that. There's an example of something, that it doesn't, it doesn't mean that all this is all fun, that people aren't getting beat up and arrested and, that movements fail and all this kind of thing. But you can see that there are moments that I would like to encourage where there's this feeling like, hey, we're all in it together here. And then we can sort out the details. But as long as we're, you know, here together for ourselves. Anyway, enough of that.
Hey, Ken,
Yes.
I'd like to say one other thing because Ed Barcelone asked in the chat if you and I knew each other back then. And we didn't, except that I remember the first time I ever came across you, you were standing on a street corner in San Francisco handing out leaflets, and I took one of the leaflets. And that's how I became aware of your existence. And then growing out of Occupy, I can't remember exactly what year it was, but not long after Occupy, you taught or facilitated a reading group at the Omni of the Society of the Spectacle. So I took that group.
Right. Thanks. I didn't remember the exact, I knew we met each other around that time, but I didn't, and you were in these groups, but anyway, of course, retrospectively, we did have some mutual friends and all that, but
Well, the research group is where I met Steve Martino.
uh-huh.
So I've known him since then.
Yeah. So any other comments from people? John S., do you have any comments?
Not many today. I really enjoyed the readings, but I was out of the country at the time of Occupy, so I was, seeing it from afar. I did notice that your talk at the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library at Berkeley, in the footnote concluding the text, you wrote, quote, slightly edited transcription of an improvised talk.
Right.
Listening to the talk, the situation was much funnier than what the text alludes to. You start by saying, I'm paraphrasing, that someone took your notes for the talk, probably mistakenly thinking that it was a free pamphlet being handed out. You then say that you wing it by improvising. I think your presentation was probably better without notes. You never seemed at a loss. How do you remember that talk? Losing the notes struck me as a fortuitous accident.
Yeah, actually, it turned out later that my notes were in my stuff. I thought maybe somebody had picked them up, but as often happen, like I had molded over enough so that I didn't really need the notes. That's just something to sort of in case you don't want to leave out something,
Yeah, no, I thought that was excellent. And also on page 230, I was particularly impressed by your 11 bullet points in response to the question, looking back, what do you see as the movement's most significant features or innovations? And I thought you may want to go over that a little at some point because that was really interesting for me. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, I'll do that. Danny.
Um, yeah, that's what I was going to say is close to what how John concluded, and I foreshadowed this in the social time before we got started. So I'm just curious what you can or what anybody else thinks 15 years later, what impacted how is Occupy, how are the effects of Occupy felt today?
Yeah,
That's
I
my
think
question.
I'd like to see hear what others say, but my immediate thought is that the various Trump resistances, even though the mood is rather different, it's a different situation. It seems to me like people had gotten used to the idea that thousands of people could come together fervently, for certain causes without knowing exactly what the solutions would be. But they would think the solutions are partly in our doing this, in our participation. When we come together, we'll find, if we've got some problems, we'll talk about them. And if we need to solve some problems, we'll, like I think Occupy sort of opened up that open spirit. Like before Occupy, people were just sort of winging it on little issues here or there or something, but it could be kind of discouraging. And suddenly with Occupy, you had this, it just all kind of opened up and you could see, wow, we really are the 99%. Why are we hesitating here? And I think that mood has carried over, even though it's like a half a generation later. Judy.
Oh, yeah, my question kind of bleeds into what Danny was saying and what you just said, but why do you think Occupy hasn't been repeated?
Most of these things don't get repeated. Like you would think, oh, they had a revolution over here. Why didn't they just do the same thing next year? But, the situations are different. And often what made a revolution or a revolt really impactful was that it was improvised. And which meant partly people were taken by surprise, but also that the ruling powers were taken by surprise. So maybe, the same thing isn't going to repeat.
But Occupy was so more effective than just all these demonstrations and things we have. I mean, Occupy was really moving. It was,
Yeah, absolutely. It was something it was a project we were doing. It was like a big dance. It wasn't just a protest. That's the whole thing. It was like uh, making out of protesty things a home.
exactly.
The streets that you don't go home after the protest, which is what you usually do after a protest. Uh, but anyway, uh, in Joy of Revolution, partly I do want certain things to repeat. I mean, that's a good question because people do ask that. Like, well, if that worked so well, why didn't they just go back and do more? But often it doesn't work that way. Sometimes it does. Like, take the civil rights movement. You had some pretty dramatic things like that in the late 50s, and they did keep snowballing. but they didn't do it in a really predictable manner. You know, there would be a boycott here or a sit-in over here, or, you know, a march on Washington over here or something. And some of them would work and some of them would flop, you know, and people don't really know. Like the people who started Occupy Wall Street, there are things like that going on all the time, and usually they never get off the ground. I mean, if we were here at this group, you know, like with 20 or 30 people here and said, oh, let's go sit down in the middle of the campus or in the middle of Telegraph Avenue or Shattuck or something and do something, we might do that and think, oh, that's going to stop traffic or that's going to attract attention, and nothing would happen. People would just drive by or they'd stop. Why are you doing this? Oh, we're trying to call attention to blah, blah, blah. Oh, that's nice. Right on. So long. You know, and Occupy Wall Street could have been like that. It could have been a few dozen people meeting at a place and nothing happens. And we've never heard about it. But it just happened because, you know, people sort of set a certain date and people all over the country were sort of looking at that date, that it triggered that thing. But you just can't predict those things. Kim?
Well, I wanted to add that I think, in my opinion, Occupy was a result of the 2007-2008 Wall Street plunder. However, it was a 3-year delay because there's no organized left in this country. So it looked like perhaps there was no instigation or no reason for it, but it was actually a delayed reaction to the Wall Street plunder and the bailouts. And mostly what I saw when I would be marching, and I marched a lot, most of the signage was about tax avoidance, tax the rich. And I sometimes got frustrated because there wasn't much about environmental destruction. I was also working with 350.org at the time, Bill McKibben's group. We were trying to organize a march in San Francisco. And I kept, after Occupy began, I kept telling the people on 350.org, we don't have to go to all this trouble to organize a march and get permits and insurance and all this stuff because Occupy exists. You can just go over, join in, and carry whatever signs you want. And not too many people did. But one of the thrilling aspects to Occupy Oakland was it was what the anarchists call prefigurative politics. They were modeling the camp on the future society. So general assemblies were direct democracy. I mean, those were wonderful. It was so exciting to be there because I've sat through so many hours of Vallejo City Council meetings where the vote is 7-0 or whatever, 6-1, and you go to a general assembly and the votes are, 793 to 102. I mean, everybody gets to vote. One thing I think that grew out of Occupy, whatever you think about it, is Bernie Sanders and his campaign, and some socialist or at least social democratic ideas. So I wanted to add that.
Thank you. Danny?
Kim bringing up both the financial crisis and signage leads to what I raised my hand to add, which is I just remembered one of my all-time favorite signs was from Occupy Wall Street, and it said, "Jump fuckers."
Referring back to the Great Depression era,
Yes.
where the some of the bankers apparently did jump out. of their
So-
skyscrapers, you know, when they've lost all their money.
There was a great sign, I'll never forget it, in Occupy Oakland. Someone had the sign, fuck Mr. Potter. Remember Mr. Potter from It's a Wonderful Life? He was the banker.
Oh,
I thought that says it all in few words.
let's see, people who haven't talked, Sid, do you have any comments?
Well, I just loved reading all about this. I personally remember going downtown Oakland one day and running into this guy who might have been previously a homeless guy, or he's very interesting, well-spoken. This sort of relates to I think what you said, Ken, and others probably said about how there was some sort of sense of something different happening, like a sense of modeling like the new world or a different world. And it might have even been somewhat a little like the anarchist collectives, although I don't know that much about that. But I remember he didn't know me, I didn't know him. There were these sort of wooden walkways that people set up, like these slats that were and he took me on a tour. He said, "Oh, come on, let me go show you what's going on." And there was like a first aid, there was like a library section, there was a first aid section, there were people that were doing some kind of food or cooking section. And I just remember getting the goosebumps, seeing that. It was kind of like, whoa, this is like really different. And I think it relates to what others, perhaps the situation is what you said about how, I think you said this a number of times in various parts of this reading, where it's about, you get a sense that of possibility, it's like, I think you've said a couple of times about waking from sleepwalking. I noticed like today, I sort of woke up and I kind of felt like I was sleepwalking in the world. I was trying to get out of that, but it was like not easy. And I don't know, never went back. I remember the whole thing of the strike. It's probably because I was working and had to do stuff. But I was really, really thrilled about that. Also, the other thing I did want to second the emotion of John Salt, John S. The looking back on Occupy. I thought that was very, I like that. It seemed like were trying to find out what was happening, and it was really, I thought you were very to the point and spoke about, I think there were a lot of good points in that section. I did have a question for you in the group about, because I'm not that familiar with the way Occupy Wall Street started. So thanks to Kim for, or I think it was Kim or maybe Mike, for mentioning that it was the delayed reaction to the 2007-8 bailout, which the capitalists basically said had to be done, right? Because if it hadn't been done,
Too
the
big to
world,
fail.
the world as we know it would be over, right? Which was kind of interesting. But there must be some sort of history or some sort of, has anybody written about or said anything about how that all started?
I'm sure they have, but I
You're
haven't
not, you're not
followed it.
aware of it, Anyway, thanks for all this stuff. It's really great.
Yeah,
Could I just say that I think we're looking into the future, that there's going to be another big AI bailout, and we're going to be suffering from that because all this money that's invested in AI now is probably going to, not going to work out, and somebody's going to have to bail all those billionaires out, and it's probably going to be us, like it usually is. But nobody's saying anything about this.
That's a good point. Well, I think people are starting to, it's becoming kind of apparent, but yeah, the same situation. John M.
Yeah, so that last comment actually reminded me of the Great Depression, which I don't, I've read, I haven't read extensively, but I read enough to know that at some point it was um, directly precipitated by Rockefeller because there were certain points where he kept bailing out the banks and bailing out the situation when it was getting bad. And at a certain point, he just said, I've had it. And he didn't do that. Of course, when he didn't do it, it profited him. I think he still made tons of money off the whole collapse. But yeah, that just reminded me of that. As far as Occupy, I had a good friend. I don't know if you knew him, Scott Ellsworth, who went to Scheimer. He owned the Uptown Bar in the Mission, and I came to visit him. And I guess I knew it was going on, but I mean, I got here, we went to sleep the next morning. He was like, come on, we're going down to Market Street, Occupy's on. And it was just a great thing to just get out there and be with all the people and see everything that was happening. And yeah, and then it was kind of interesting because of course we had Occupy Chicago, which was kind of in the near the border trade. And it's kind of interesting to think of something like that starting in New York and building up and building up. And I kind of remember, because I didn't go downtown a lot, I remember going downtown towards the end, and where there had been all these people, there were like two last guys holding signs, and you think about when it started and where was the last gasp, when finally the last two guys said, well, I guess it's over. And they went home. So anyway, that was my comment.
Yeah, thank you. I think Danny said on this interview, looking back on Occupy, they ask, looking back, what do you see as the movement's most significant features or innovations? And I actually thought of like 3 pages worth. I mean, it's really, I said there were several interrelated. Some were genuine innovations. Some were just things we picked up from other countries like Tunisia, Egypt, Greece, Spain, and so on. The fact that it appeared so suddenly, without any particular issue, being things, although of course there was that financial thing as a sort of underpinning. The fact that the agenda was open and everyone was welcome. Normally in protests and things like that, the agenda is pretty fixed. We're here because we're against the Vietnam War or for civil rights or something, and it's kind of narrow. But in this case, the content of the thing was, we are just coming together in a public space to discuss what what do we do about this world that we're in. So very open. And I mean, there were no rules. I mean, in theory, somebody could have come there, who was right wing or, whatever. And they could say, oh, I think the problem is such and such. Or, but the point is that everybody got to say their piece. And so this, that was so open that almost instantly the Occupy movement did not seem like a leftist thing, like almost all these other protests tend to be. You could actually have, and in some parts of the country, you had people, like Republicans went there. They said, what's going on here? Or something. In other words, there was not something that just from the first step that said, get away from here. You don't belong here. This is only for people who feel such and such. There wasn't something like that. You can just walk right in and say, hey, can I take part? Yeah, sure. You know, stand in line there and you can wait your turn and you can talk for 3 minutes or you know, whatever. And so when people kind of sense that in some cases, that's the first time they've ever actually participated in democracy, really, not counting about, you know, voting for some distant thing. And I was thinking this was one of the reasons that so many people were won over so quickly. At the same time, it suggested a provocative terrain for these gatherings. Quote, exercise your right to peaceably assemble, occupy public space. This was just a kind of semi-legal thing that gave a little bit of an edge to it. You know, as I said, there's nothing like wondering whether the police will move in to arrest you, to encourage speaking to the point and sticking to practicalities. And then from the very beginning, it was apparent to everyone that this was a participatory movement, not just something you would watch from afar. In most cities, you could just walk in there. You didn't have to have permission or anything. And the occupiers' unexpected refusal to specify any particular demand. And when we're so used to demands, you know, abolish this, you know, make a law for this or something. And so the fact that when asked, what do you want? Do you have some particular demands? No. Or, as I said, another way of putting it is, yeah, we have 1,000 demands. You know, depending on how you look at it. No, we don't have some particular thing that we want a law passed or that we want this thing or something. Obviously, we want all sorts of things like that, but we're looking at the whole thing and saying it's not enough to just demand this or this detail. The occupiers, in contrast to previous radical struggles that would come together and then disperse and so on, this was for the long haul. You know, if you establish an Occupy, it means that some of the people are staying there overnight. Maybe not everybody, but a lot of people. So there's a sort of ongoing thing. It's not like we're just here for a couple hours. For many of us, there was an illuminating on the ground experience. Like my minimal camping thing was at Occupy Berkeley. I stayed a few nights in a tent there. And so, you know, you're there in tents with homeless people next to you in their tents. How many of you have had that experience? You know, I'm not saying that you need to have it or something. I'm just saying it's something that normally would not happen. I mean, I'm not going to volunteer, like pick up and go to some homeless and, you know, encampment under a bridge or something like that. It wouldn't help them, you know, but in this case, it was the appropriate thing to do. Hey, we're all here. And in that case, the homeless people could be giving us advice about how to get along. Oh, here's how you do that. Or here's, you know, because they've been doing this more than we had. So it's a little humbling thing. You know, it's a mixed thing there. And it doesn't mean there weren't problems because a lot of homeless people have psychological issues, et cetera, as long as economic ones. You know, but it brought people together. The fact that it spread so widely and rapidly, many of us were used to the idea that American radical activity mostly took place in the larger cities on the two coasts and had despaired of the vast regions of conservative and clueless mid-America, in contrast to many blah, blah, blah. But in this case, within 2 weeks, there were things like, as I mentioned in both of my talks, I'm from Springfield, Missouri, which is in the Ozarks and a pretty conservative region. And there was an Occupy Springfield. And when I went back to visit my parents on my annual thing there, you know, I hooked up with Occupy Springfield, you know, and as you might expect, it was sort of not as militant as other places, but it was great. you know, and the other people who weren't in Occupy were still kind of, you know, they were respectful of it because they had read in the news, oh, this is a big thing. And, you know, so they would come to interview these few people in Occupy Springfield saying, well, what's this all about? What do you guys want? You know, and then that would get reported in the local paper. Whereas normally the local paper is like practically John Birch Society or something. I mean, it's completely out of it. You know, you would never hear anything like that. And so suddenly there's, you know, this is seeping into these areas that are not radical places. And it was able to spread like this due to internet and other social media. That's become pretty obvious. Wouldn't have happened 50 years ago. And because of that kind of thing, it was like nobody owned it. You know, there were millions of people kind of debating things and sharing videos and emails and posts and all this kind of stuff. And it's like a sort of communism of ideas, you know, that it was proceeding faster than so-and-so writes article about such and such. Well, that still went on, sure. But most of what was happening a lot faster and more directly. It's just like somebody posts something and then somebody shares it, and pretty soon the next day, 1 million people have heard that slogan or that idea. And who invented the idea? Who gives a shit? It's just like that David Graeber thing about who invented the 99% thing. It doesn't really matter. He was sort of involved in it, and you can interview him and all that. But nobody cares. You know, it's so. And finally, this is one of the things. This manner of spreading also had the unforeseen effect of creating an unusual degree of autonomy among the different occupies. As I noted in my leaflet, The Awakening in America, quote, each of the new occupations and assemblies remains totally not autonomous. Though inspired by the original Wall Street occupation, they have all been created by the people in their own communities, period. No outside person or group has the slightest control over any of these assemblies. Nobody even pretended to, which is just as it should be, unquote. This autonomy was so obvious that no one could have denied it. Yet, oddly enough, I can't recall anyone else ever noting its importance. Amid all the differences between the occupies in different cities, no one ever dared to suggest that any occupy should defer to any other. As I went on to note, this had two great advantages. Quote, the proliferation of autonomous groups and actions is safer and more fruitful than the top-down, quote, unity for which bureaucrats are always appealing. Safer because it counteracts repression. If the occupation in one city is crushed or co-opted, the movement will still be alive and well in 100 others. More fruitful because this diversity enables people to share and compare among a wider range of tactics and ideas, unquote. I considered this latter feature so significant that at one point I toyed with the idea of putting out a, quote, appeal for the continued autonomy of each occupy, unquote. This would have been amusing because political appeals are almost always aimed at changing something bad, whereas in this case, I would have had the easy and pleasant task of urging the occupiers to keep doing exactly what they were already doing. Now, of course, the circumstances have changed in some ways due to the destruction of the encampments, but I still think that most of the above features remain exemplary. So, those were some of the things that I thought were unique or either original or notable about the Occupy movement? Alfredo, unmute yourself. You need to unmute yourself, Alfredo. Alfredo, we can't hear you. There you go.
I was in my 70s when the Occupy movement occurred in Berkeley. And being an old man, I just covered the city park and the campus. It was interesting that being an artist, I was working as a photographer. And when the campus police took down the tents on the campus, I was there the next morning, and in where the tents were, there were these books that were open up and laying on the grass like tents, little tents. Well, this is a cultural memory that appealed to art museums in Europe, and the photograph that I took was first published by a Berkeley paper. I don't know if it's still in print, but it was noticed by several museums in Europe, and I was asked if I could provide them copies of that photograph of the tents, of the books as tents. So there's a cultural memory that goes beyond just Berkeley.
Yeah, thank you. Dirk, unmute yourself, please.
Three notes. One, what's your thoughts about no kings? Two, I have been a marcher since 1954, but I'm not sure I can argue that my feet on the ground has affected any social change. The third one is on August 6th, Lawrence Livermore Laboratory will have a protest commemorating the 1945 bombing of Hiroshima. Anyway, do I have a philosophical or sociological imperative to attend that rally?
I think you need to do what you feel you are drawn to. I think I'd like to hear, Stuart, did you have any question or comment?
Yes, first you have to tell me whether you can hear and see me.
I can hear you.
Okay, I should be visible now, maybe. But anyway, it doesn't matter. My comment is just that I went down to the one in Boston, and I was, I wasn't following it that closely. It just sort of appeared, and I thought, oh, this is, it was in New York. I thought that's really cool. But then I went to the one in Boston that had already couple, maybe a weeks had passed because I was traveling or something. And I just remember thinking, I really love the vibe of it. And I sensed the same thing about what I was reading about the Wall Street vibe. And I didn't realize yet that it was literally happening, as far and wide as you guys are talking about. But I just felt like, okay, but this is kind of, unless there's some next step, it's kind of doomed because they're on public property and people are going to be pissed and the police are going to move in. The cities are all struggling. What are we going to do? And the coolest part for me was just knowing that it was sort of accentuating the problem of the 1% having so much power and the 99% being homeless and living in these very same public spaces that we were now occupying or whatever. And I thought that is a cool thing. But again, I was very influenced by the media. I was just like, but there's no goal here. I mean, if I'd known the situation, this sort of connection that you're making, where it's like the goal is general assemblies like this that run our lives, and I could sort of sense that from they were modeling it. I just worried already, this is just doomed. And so I don't know what to make of that, but I feel like a lot of people felt that way. Like it's asking a huge commitment, like, oh, I should move down here and be with them so that the police can take us away. I mean, without an actual demand. You know what I mean? So that was my kind of reaction to it at the time, just to share it.
Yeah, well, again, it's a normal reaction to have that, but as I responded earlier to Judy, these things that happen, you can try to plan, you can, do a certain action or something that will generate publicity or something, but it usually doesn't work out like you would have liked it to. And then just when you're over here, something happens back there and you say, what the hell caused that? And suddenly there's this big thing going on. And the point is, like I said in Joy of Revolution, one of the aims of this book is to point out recurring patterns so people can recognize and seize such opportunities before it's too late. So for me, when I saw the Occupy movement, even though I had never seen anything like it, I immediately think, oh, this is kind of like, May 68, or it's kind of like the 60s were something. And it's sort of like what I've been working towards, even though, but most people aren't even going to be at that thing. And even if people at that sort of level, they're still not going to necessarily know what to do. It's just that, as DeBoer said at the end of his film Society of the Spectacle, after we've seen all this May 68 stuff, he says, we have to acknowledge, we have to face the fact that it's going to take a dozen May 68s before we ever win, if we ever do. So May 68 was phenomenal. I mean, it was more phenomenal than the Occupy movement. But, it was over after a month. And it carried its reverberations, just like the Occupy movement or like the 60s have reverberations. But each time, you sort of have to start over again. But if there are people who remember the previous one or some, if you can carry on enough continuity, you won't be totally reinventing the wheel each time. So that's all you can say, is that when we talk about things like class consciousness, it's not like a little thing going in somebody's mind or something. It has to do with this sort of collective memory or collective know-how that gets passed on, or it's what I called in my last text, the hive mind. It's a very vague, amorphous kind of thing, but sometimes you can say, oh, that worked out well, or this looks like it's moving in this direction favorably, or something. We're groping in the dark, basically, when we wonder how to do something. There's no fixed formula as to how you trigger something like the Occupy movement. You just try and see like that. Bill B.
So, I mean, there were some characteristics of Oakland where you had the mayor, who's Gene Kwan, and another person who's high up in the administration, Dan Siegel, who had, kind of radical histories in their background. And towards the end of Occupy, there was like this, there was people like saying we need to change the name from Occupy Oakland to Decolonize Oakland. And it's like I'm curious about like what concepts come out of actions like this. My lens was somewhat formed by my being involved in the 1985 Berkeley anti-apartheid movement. And so there would be like emotional realizations that I would have, like, oh, this is a box that they're trying to put us in. These are the rules, but we'll learn so much more if we go against the rules, And when people started doing this, like I get the feeling like, oh my God, this is a taste of what it's like to be free. And that emotional breakthrough, it's like, I need to treasure this, because it's going to be a long struggle and I need to, fuel myself and keep warm by this fire of memory of what it's like to be free with like these people who, you like watch these people coming out of a football game and going like, you don't know what I've been feeling. But then there was like another feeling that was going on, which was, as we like focus more on like, if you don't get an reaction from the police, you're not doing enough. There's like another realization that's like, wow, it doesn't matter if you didn't do anything. It doesn't matter if you're not guilty. They can still arrest you. They can still beat you up. They can still lie. And there are lots of people who have to live with this every day of their lives, and don't realize that. The last thing I want to say is like a couple years after Occupy, people who were younger who were in it were going like, oh, my life is over. It will, I'll never be in such a big action again. And so I think like the notion of like connecting with history and allows one to persist and not, it's like, we may have been defeated, but this doesn't need to turn into a rout, and, what is the collective memory that builds for next time? And just one more thing is like, sometimes I feel like having a sign like saying, we're for capitalism with socialist characteristics, but, that's just me being clever.
Thank you, Bill. Kim.
Well, Stuart brought up a good point that I thought about occasionally. How far are you going to get by occupying city plazas? I mean, you're not going to do that forever. But you'll never forget, if you're involved in an experience like this, you never forget it because it's so exciting. Like you've mentioned in some of your essays, every rock is overturned. Everybody's exploring every issue, maybe not every issue, but many issues. And you're thinking about things that you haven't thought about for a long time. And just the experience of direct democracy is something you just never forget. I sometimes would compare Occupy to the 1871 Commune, completely different situations. I mean, the Commune was taking place in the middle of a war. They lasted about the same length of time, but in the communards actually took over the running of the city. They took over the administration of the city. Occupy didn't do that. It was more like theater. It was like, okay, we're going to act like we're in the society that we want to be in, even though we're not in it. But I think that's in and of itself is very significant. And as you say, you learn from all these experiences.
Yeah.
So
one thing the commune didn't take over, as Marx pointed out,
the bank.
The bank.
Yeah.
If they had taken over the bank, they would have had the rulers by the balls, so to speak.
And they didn't march on Versailles.
Yeah. So,
but
anyway, good. And obviously, again, as you say, totally different kind of thing. But the thing is, our situation is not like the Paris Commune
right.
in all sorts of ways. Fortunately, actually, we've got a lot of more wiggle room but that wiggle room can also mean that we just float along, you know, and don't do anything or something. They were, but I think that as Bill was just saying, you know, like when you're in this situation, as you were also saying, Kim, you get just this feeling that you've come into a different world. Like here, when I was talking at Occupy Oakland, I said, when a popular movement throws the ruling system on the defensive, it opens things up. It's as if we've been living all our lives in a closed building with no windows. And suddenly there's a little crack in the wall you can peek through. And you see that there's another world out there. Maybe you had suspected there was something out there, but now you can actually see it. Hey, look, there's something out there. Maybe we can open the crack a little wider and go out there. So that's kind of how you feel. Another friend of mine said when we were out at that November 2nd at Occupy, he just said, you know, there's a different feeling here. I just feel like I've been carrying a weight on my back all my life, and now it's off. I don't know how many of you have read Pilgrim's Progress, but in the main character there, Christian, has a pack on his back that just sort of weighs him down. But then when he gets to the promised land, the pack just drops off. And I kind of felt like that when my friend was talking to me. It was Jim Brook. You know, just say, you know, we don't realize we're just going around and we've got this pressure constantly on us. And suddenly we say, wait a minute, that's not a fact of life. That's not a requirement. It doesn't, we don't have to be carrying that thing around. But it's only in those little moments that we sense that. Wolfie, do you have any questions or comments?
Yeah, I've been listening to Anselm Yapa, who I'm sure you know him.
Yes.
Every time he talks in these lectures, he dismisses Occupy as this populist movement, and I'm not exactly sure what he means by that, but he's very dismissive of it. And I don't know, I think it's kind of a weak thing because Occupy had this positive General Assembly stuff going on, but I don't know. I just wanted to see what you thought about that.
Yeah, well, I disagree with him. You know, I mean, we can have discussions about, well, in this situation, was this appropriate? But like when I look at Occupy, like in comparison with almost any other political thing that I've experienced directly, all those other things are just hardly compare. They're just like you're just listening to a speaker. You know, you're going down a planned march against the war or something. You know, there's just some narrow little thing that you're doing, and you're doing it explicitly to try to pressure politicians to change their policies, pretty much. So if somebody is doing all these open things that Occupy movement is doing, to me, that's really exciting. You know, yeah, it's not a revolution, but you know, it's getting in that terrain, which, you know, I disagree with him. Let me just see here, other people that haven't. Zandin, did you have any comments or questions? This is a correspondent who I just ran into that.
I do want to say thank you for replying to my message so quickly. It's really sort of a pleasant surprise. honestly, this being my first kind of, interaction with the group, I thought it would be good for me to kind of sit back and listen, at least this time, for the most part. And I do think it's really, like it's been really interesting for me to be able to kind of be a participant, if a passive one, and so I really appreciate that. And it's also, I guess something I've been curious about when it comes to, I guess, things like these. It can be kind of a matter of like, even just like mathematically, at what point does like, I guess like thinking back to like Huey Newton's, I believe, kind of concept of revolutionary suicide. At what point are you already dead and figure, you know what, I might as well get the most out of this life or this death in terms of moving the needle as I can, and if that point of like, but like if there's a kind of like comforted stasis that's maintained, like would you think that point's necessary for like actual change? I don't really know too much, and that's why I've been silent.
Well, that whole phrase revolutionary suicide, to me, it seems so absurd. I even made fun of it in a poster that I did back in 1971, as typifying the sort of death trip that so many kind of Stalinists and other authoritarians are in or were in there, where I mean, I sympathize when people are living a miserable existence, that sure, you do anything if you're in jail or you're risking being tortured or stuff like that. I'm never saying don't react in this, but I'm saying if we want to do this strategically, uh, I don't buy it. I mean, that's exactly the opposite of what the situationists were talking about. I mean, uh, the whole, we were talking earlier about Vanism and that kind of thing. And I was criticizing the sort of simplisticness of saying, oh, revolution for the pleasure of it or something like this. But the point is that they did have, there, it really is appropriate to go in the other direction of revolutionary suicide, as if revolution meant, that you can think nothing else. Is that the only way you can think to fight? To kill yourself? I mean, and you expect other people to rally to that cause? I mean, really, it's just disgusting. Like if somebody's in a desperate position, okay, they go for it, uh, suicide bomber or some, like, well, like those people in Vietnam who burned themselves to death during the Vietnam War. I don't know that that's a good thing to do, and I certainly, but they at least had some excuse, like that, they were willing to do that, and it did probably help in the Vietnam War. It was one of the little factors. But just the idea of like saying, let's organize around, yay, suicide, yay, sacrifice everything, for some future that may never exist. I mean, that's not what appeals to me, and I don't think it appeals to more people. One of the reasons Occupy spread so fast is that nobody was talking like that. Nobody said, come to Occupy where we may get killed, where we'll probably get killed, but so what? We'll sacrifice ourselves for the revolution. Can you imagine anybody showing up for such an asinine thing? And yet, a lot of the traditional leftisms end up being like that, you know. And as I said in now looking back where I was talking about the black bloc and this kind of stuff, I don't want to get into the black bloc specifically, but I was talking about how after that November 2nd attempt at a general strike in Oakland, we were like walking on clouds on that day. And, you know, it was like we had so many people there that there were no police around. And even if there had been 1,000 police around, they would have been helpless. You know, we got 50,000 people. What are you going to do? Arrest everybody? You know, and so then a few people later on decide that it's a great idea to go and smash some windows. And, you know, I can't help but think, you know, there's very possibly they were provocateurs. They're policemen. But be that as it may, if they're not policemen, they're doing exactly what policemen would do. So here, this is in that same interview. So I'm talking about this, and I said, actually, it was more a matter of tone than of tactics, more a matter of bravado than of violence. As always, the real violence came almost exclusively from the police. The black bloc's supposed violence amounted to nothing more than a few broken windows, a few bottles thrown from a distance, and a few make-believe barricades that wouldn't have stopped a baby carriage. But those macho posturings played into the hands of the ruling order, enabling its spectacle to reframe the struggle. In place of a joyous, welcoming, inclusive, and rapidly growing movement coming together to create a new world, we were now offered a rerun of the stale old militants versus police scenario. That scenario naturally tended to discourage any other form of participation and to shove most people back into the role of passive spectators. The militants wondered where everybody went, and some of them eventually concluded that the fault lay with everybody but themselves, the so-called, the quote, liberals, the reformists, the pacifists, and other ordinary people were to blame for no longer turning out to support the heroic minority of suicidal revolutionary martyrs. This is the sort of vanguardist delirium that destroyed the American radical movement in the late 1960s and early 70s, and it is no wonder that most people have no interest in going there again. I don't wish to totally disparage the black bloc efforts. Although some of those actions were probably instigated by provocateurs, it is clear that most of them grew out of a sincere and quite understandable rage against the system. It should also be noted that many of those who took part in them had also been involved in some of the most admirable constructive actions in the encampments. The problem is that they do not seem to have ever seriously considered the ultimate effects of their tactics. In this regard, they might do well to examine some of the blitz tactics that appeared during the French anti-CPE struggle of 2006. The French insurgents were certainly aggressive, but they were creatively aggressive rather than merely reactive and impulsive. As I noted at the time, here I'm quoting from this earlier article, mass demonstrations have a greater force of numbers, but they lack the flexibility that enables blitzes to move rapidly and to disperse and regroup as appropriate. This was the main reason for the development of so-called black bloc tactics in recent years. But black blocs are often caught up in silly fantasies of street fighting or urban guerrilla warfare. Blitzers, that's like the French people, strive to evade the system's strength and exploit its weaknesses, challenging it on the level of feelings and ideas as well as physical force. While Black Bloc actions tend to be impulsive, grimly self-important, and purely destructive, blitzes contain a larger element of calculation, creativity, and humor, unquote. So I'm not sure, Zandon, if that's what you were talking about, but that's my reaction to that slogan. Let's see.
Yeah, thank you. My phone had died, kind of in the middle, but I did catch a lot of it at the end.
Okay, I was mostly just quoting myself anyway. If you read my articles there, you'll get it. Let's see who else.
Ken,
Yes, Ken.
Ed Barcelona
yes.
has a question in the chat about what killed Occupy. If you have any ideas. Ken, in your opinion, what was the main event that killed the movement? In Oakland, was it the violence from the Black Bloc types? If so, it brings to mind this De Boer quote, "The greatest ambition of the integrated spectacular is still that secret agents become revolutionaries and that revolutionaries become secret agents."
Yeah, I think in that thing I just read, if I had to pick something, that would be a major point. But there's all kinds of other factors going on. I don't want to just put the blame on, a few of these people doing what I consider unadvisable things. But I think that actually, I'll read the paragraph before that thing that I just read, where I was describing, how I said the occupiers were thrown back on the defensive by those vandalisms and proved unable to resolve the issue to anyone's satisfaction. A large majority of the General Assemblies recognized that such vandalism was counterproductive, but a sizable minority blocked abandonment of the diversity of tactics policy. That policy, it originally sounded like a reasonable compromise, but in practice it meant that a tiny minority could crash a demonstration even if most of the participants wished it to be nonviolent. The latter then had the unenviable choice of allowing the minority to hijack their demonstration or being denounced as peace police if they tried to prevent it. A month later, following the continued excessive media focus on, quote, irresponsible Black Bloc violence, unquote, the Oakland portion of the December 12th West Coast blockade drew perhaps 5,000 people. Remember, the general strike had drawn about 50,000. Okay, so 5,000 people, that's pretty good. The mood, though still enthusiastic at times, was more subdued and uneasy, and few newcomers were showing up anymore. One of the characteristics of these Occupy things in their prime was that thousands of people were showing up from all over the place every day. New people saying, "Oh, I'll go check that out." Now, after you get these images of these masked people breaking windows, and telling everybody else to fuck off. People, amazingly enough, were not showing up. Like saying, "Oh, let's go see those." A month and a half after that, the attempted takeover of an Oakland public building on January 28th drew scarcely more than 1,000 people. Actions since that time have rarely drawn more than a few hundred. The numbers tell the story. It would oversimplify matters to attribute all this decline to Black Bloc tactics, but the connection was undeniable. I mean, there was just a whole different mood It just changed from one day to another. So that's a factor. I mean, I'm certainly willing to say, oh, there were other factors. This assembly decided to do this or that or something. It's a big movement. And like I say, even that one thing, that just was Occupy Oakland. It didn't necessarily affect other occupies, except in the sense that Occupy Oakland had been one of the exemplary, it was the most militant Occupy in the country, probably. And so if it starts getting to be sort of dubious, like what's going on there, that hurts other occupies just in the sense of it's losing some of its exuberance. So that's my Sid.
So that's a problem that you point out was difficult to handle, like because no, it's sort of like damned if you do and damned if you don't, right?
Right.
And I don't have an answer. I don't have a solution, but recognizing it as a problem is probably a good thing.
Yeah, you may remember that I have a short in Joy of Revolution, a short subchapter called Terrorism Reinforces the State. And I point out, like that in the past, if terrorist spectacles fail to spontaneously arise when it needs them, the state itself may produce them by means of provocateurs. And they've done that numerous times in history, where somebody smuggles themselves in. But here's a popular movement can hardly prevent individuals from carrying out terrorist or other thoughtless actions that may sidetrack and destroy it as surely as if they were the work of a provocateur. The only solution is to create a movement with such consistently forthright and non-manipulative tactics that everyone will recognize individual stupidities or police provocations for what they are. So, in other words, there's no easy, but that's Bill.
So there is the question of like, things don't last forever. And how do people get to feel like, understand like how to transform, rather than staying with, what's been familiar. So like that's one problem. And another problem that, I think of more and more is, a notion of despair that produces desperation and kind of a yearning of sort of like these apocalyptic yearnings to go out in a big flame of glory, which, given the current state of the world, becomes like more and more imminent. So having like this, healthy, notion of like there is a better future, people getting together like this is a pre-revolutionary situation, where people feel free, like talking to people that they've never talked to before, the heart opens and they get a feeling about like, this is what you want. But there needs to, it doesn't stay like that in the moment. It's transitory, but don't give into, a violence that's courting the end, because the tension of like living with reality is just so great, because there's so much pain and suffering.
Yeah. Really, many people will not admit this and would be shocked, but I think the fact is that there are millions and millions of people in the world now that would be delighted to see the whole world blow up. There's all sorts of ways on the way there or something like that. But the only way you can understand that is if precisely this system that we're in, the kind of life it is is so generally poor. I mean, to going to the extent of being extremely painful or, despairing and so on like that, that it just doesn't seem like anything else, like any sort of reformist thing or partial thing or something. You've just seen that happen too many times, and it doesn't look like it's going to solve the problems. And so then you want to do something that will just give a big fuck you. And that's why a lot of people voted for Trump. I mean, it may have sounded weird to say that at first back then, but that actually is. I mean, there are people that would have voted for Bernie Sanders, and then when Bernie Sanders was shunted out by the Democratic Party, then they thought, well, okay, well, fuck that. I'm going to vote for Trump, by golly. It's like, in other words, I'm going to show those motherfuckers that I'm pissed. And, those same people, many of them would have been, a very different kind of thing, even though it's not revolutionary exactly, to vote for something like Sanders, but the fact that Sanders just sort of got crushed, shunted aside, even though it looked like he could have won everything.
I don't know, Ken, don't you think that's kind of a reach? I don't know why people that would have voted for Bernie Sanders would have voted for Trump.
They did. It's not a reach at all. I'm not inventing that. There were polls, like how many people, you voted for Bernie Sanders, but they didn't want Hillary because that was just clearly business as usual. So they said, well, here was the good alternatives out. Oh, so I'm going to pick the bad alternative. Fuck them. Mary.
Yeah, one of the things here in New York, I don't know how many, but an impressive number of people who voted for our Democratic Socialist Mayor Mondami voted for Trump. And when I first heard that, I was like, what? But yeah, I'm sure this is the reason. It was sort of like, up yours.
So in this case, they had somebody to say, yeah, I can send a message voting for that Islamic guy, but they don't think they're going to send a message by just voting for some middle of the road business as usual person. So that's why, I mean, the Occupy movement overlapped with some of these things like the Tea Party types, as idiotic as that was. A lot of those Tea Party types were people kind of akin to the Occupy people that they were frustrated, but they're in a different part of the country. And so for them, being radical meant, voting for the Trump type or for a libertarian or so, let's see. Sid?
I like that. I read and liked the section starting on page 202, the Situationists and the occupation movements, 68 to 2011. Where you were critiquing this guy, Camilla was his name, or
yeah.
And then later on some other guy, Davis. But and the section on 202 where it talked about not inspired by what happened at the Arab. We are not just inspired by what happened in the Arab Spring recently. We are students of the Situationist movement. And then later on, you said it was a rather simplified version.
Right.
And then talked about some group called the Ad Busters, who evidently.
Okay. Yeah. The Ad Busters is a magazine that comes out every few months or so from, I think, Vancouver, somewhere up in that area. And they were the ones that, when there was this idea of occupying Wall Street, they put out an issue that specified a date. So I think they said on September 18th or whatever, I don't know whatever the day was. Meet, let's meet at Wall Street. So that meant that kind of gave another oomph to the people who were actually in New York City who had been planning something of that nature. And so that probably helped it mean that on that date, suddenly there's 1,000 people there. Whereas if there had been a few dozen people there, maybe it never would have got off the ground. So that group, that guy is the editor and co-founder of it that was being interviewed. They have pushed these kind of quasi-situationist things. I don't want to say, yeah, they've done interesting things, but it's sort of, they're focusing on the media level. Like as you might have imagined, there's a media thing about naming the date and then sending their free journal around. So when they say we were inspired by Arab Spring and so on, but we also inspired by the Situationists International, and then quotes De Boer, and all this. So I just say, well, it's a bit oversimplified. The Situationists were more than just saying, the idea is you have a very powerful meme, and if the moment is ripe, that's enough to ignite a revolution. Well, okay, sort of, but it's rather simplified. But I'm saying they have the credit that they did. I said they have the merit of adopting or adapting some of the situationist methods for active subversive use, which of course is what those messages were designed for. Here, I'm contrasting that with some of these people just writing articles.
Yeah, which is great. Did anybody ever say anything about situationists per se in the Occupy movements, or it was just, or we're talking about it now and relating what situationist theory and practice was, and talk about it.
Well, I did. Yeah, I mean, people would bring that up. As Graeber said, sure, we've all read Revolution of Everyday Life and Society of the Spectacle,
Huh.
and maybe Situationist Anthology. Those were just sort of givens, sort of quasi-anarchist scene or whatever you want to call it. These are the same people that were in the anti-nuke movements and the anti-globalism, that kind of thing there. The situationists were one of the factors behind that. As I mentioned, when in one of the talks, people said, well, what's the heritage of the situationists after, we're 50 years later? And I said, well, one thing is participation. And people forget this. People think the 1960s were real participatory. Well, the counterculture was participatory. The New Left, not so much. I remember because I was in both of them. And in the counterculture, we were all over the place, taking psychedelics and doing weird things, and before anybody ever heard of it, and doing different things and experiments. But when I was in the New Left, going on an anti-Vietnam War march or something like that, not very participatory. It's participatory in the sense that we were on a march, say, but I wasn't involved in anybody that said, what shall we do? I just saw a leaflet that said, hey, there's a rally tomorrow on campus or something. And, Tom Hayden or Jerry Rubin or somebody is giving a talk.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, let's go there and see what happens. I mean, it was much more of a spectator kind of thing, where the leaders and the political groups were on top, and we didn't even know what was going on top, really. It's just like we would show up. Oh, there's a march on Washington. Shall we go? And so back then, only the Situationists and a few other people, like the Diggers and the Motherfuckers. And the Motherfuckers had been directly influenced by the Situationists. So there was that already. I don't know if the Diggers had ever heard of them, but there weren't many, even the Yippies who kind of had that aura about them were not really participatory. They were just sort of making a spectacle of themselves or something, they were sort of a little more, so that idea of participating being the essence of, an essential thing was something that the Situationists pushed. And by that, it just gradually kind of seeped out over the next 2 decades or so. So that by the time you had the anti-nuke movements, those things were all participatory democracy. But the anti-Vietnam things and the civil rights things were not. So that's one big difference that the Situationists made. I mean, the critique of the spectacle is like an inverse way of saying, don't be spectators, take part. Our problem is that we have a society that pacifies most people so that just a few other people at the top giving the orders.
Well said.
So, well, I think we
Was there anyone at the Occupy Oakland that tried to become the new leader, or that just didn't happen?
Virtually didn't happen. I mean, there were people who were a little bit well known, like as a spokesman or something, but I don't recall anybody. And this is very different than this. In the 60s, you had these Maoists and Trotskyists and, all these different people, and you didn't even know they were there. It was just that they were there, in SDS or whatever. But I don't think people who were in the Occupies, I don't recall anyone saying, oh, we need to rally around, this, Maoist slogan or this something, because if they had, they would have just got booed off this. Actually, they would have got laughed off the stage, not just booed off the stage. Because by that time, especially after Occupy had started, but even before then, the concept that there were certain little leading groups, that were going to tell you what to do, what the correct line was just obnoxious to everybody. I mean, it was just, everybody would have looked at that and thought, how stupid is that? Who's going to, so actually Mike mentioned that in Australia, there were such people, but that's because Australia was like maybe picking up, like it was adopting the Occupy form from the United States. But in the United States, every single Occupy was self-created. People would look at Wall Street and look at Occupy Oakland and a few other big groups and for inspiration, but that's all. They would decide, well, that may be good for those people in New York, but here, let's do it this way. Okay, let's, and they'd vote on that, or they'd experiment with consensus or doing one thing or another. But it was, all those occupies were purely homegrown. That's what, that's amazing. The 60s stuff was not homegrown, believe me. It was just at least the political angle of it. So no, I don't think that we never really had to worry about that much. I mean, the only things people I had debates with was some anarchists who were being too snooty about it, and saying, oh, this is reformist, and and so I laid into them. And I said, you of all people should know better, like you don't, these movements are not made just of what let's see, here was Just a minute here. Yeah. I guess can go off for a few minutes. So one of this French interview, do you see relations between Occupy and traditional leftist groups and anarchists? And here is my reply. First of all, it should be noticed that the traditional authoritarian leftist groups, Maoists, Trotskyists, etc., have almost all faded away, and nobody pays any attention to the few that still survive. Back in the 1960s and 70s, such groups had a certain influence, and one of our primary tasks was exposing them, trying to convince people not to be taken in by them. This is now totally unnecessary. The Occupy movement was so imbued with participatory democracy that the very notion of allowing some would-be vanguard party to tell them what to do would have been jeered by everyone. The initiators of Occupy Wall Street included some anarchists and other authoritarian radicals, but the great majority of participants there and in the other encampments that sprang up around the country were ordinary people who had little or no political experience. Many were disillusioned Obama supporters. A few were even right-wing libertarians or Tea Party types who also had been angered by the recent Wall Street manipulations and bank bailouts. During the first few days, many anarchists and other leftists, and I knew these people, contemptuously dismissed the Occupy movement as mere, quote, liberal reformism, unquote. To their credit, once they realized that this was in fact a major and in some way unprecedented radical mass movement, most of them dropped their preconceptions and took part in it with an open mind to see what they might learn as well as what they might teach. But some persisted in seeing the struggle in terms of their old ideological perspectives, as if the most important thing was how many people they could win over to an explicitly, quote, anti-capitalist or anti-state perspective. As I stressed in the Awakening leaflet, I think the dynamic of a popular movement is far more important than its ostensible ideological positions. It is quite natural that people react against particular grievances without waiting until it becomes feasible to envision more fundamental social changes. Moreover, they are unlikely to ever arrive at the latter stage if they have never tested their strength or developed their critical capacities in more immediate struggles. Once they are engaged in this process, they will soon enough figure out for themselves if they need to go further. Virtually every revolution in history has passed through such phases. To take just one striking example, here I'm talking to French people, remember. In early 1789, the French people were asked to submit complaints or demands that their representatives could bring to a national meeting of the estates. These cahiers de doléances, registries of grievances, raised hundreds of different issues, but they were virtually all of the form, the king should change this or that law. The king should abolish this or that tax. The king should order the nobles to stop doing this or that. A superficial observer at that time might have concluded that the movement was not only totally reformist, but totally monarchist. 1789. Yet a few months later, the Bastille had fallen, and 3 years later, the king had been beheaded. So it's just a glaring example from the past, like that you don't look at something and say, oh, these people don't have a radical program. You know, as if, so, and I think most people understood that after a while, but really in the first week or two, I had some anarchist friends who were just kind of, what's that? I said, oh, I've been at the Occupy movement. They said, oh, I suppose you saw The Usual Suspects? And I said, no, I didn't see The Usual Suspects. I saw about 1,000 other people, though. You know, I mean, once they went there, of course they were immediately won over. It would have been idiotic to continue to say, oh, they're not anarchist enough for me or something. So anyway, I think we've run over time a little bit here. So next week, we have one more meeting for this book, 2 weeks from now. And so the assignment, which I'll send out, is just to read the remaining articles, which have to do with the more recent 15 years or so, with all that implies. And then we'll be moving on to some other very different works. But I thank you so much for your participation here and questions and comments. And please bring your friends 2 weeks from now, and I hope to see you all there.
Thanks, Ken.
Thanks.
And
Thanks.
Bye, Ken.
Ciao.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Going, gone.